Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first installment of Westminster College's B.W. Bastian Foundation Diversity Lecture Series for the 2021-2022 academic year. In just a few moments, we will hear from our keynote speaker for tonight's lecture titled Settling on a Critical Race Consciousness. I'm Dr. Tamara Stevenson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve as the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer here at Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah. The theme for this year's series is the counter story, how policy responds to identity. This theme grew organically from the amplified debate on the wrongful and rightful realities of critical race theory, alongside the intensified civil and social unrest exacerbated by the COVID-19 global pandemic in 2020. Counter storytelling is one of the foundational tenets of critical race theory. This legitimate form of exploration and inquiry magnifies the lived experiences, stories, histories, and truths of structurally marginalized communities. This theme seeks to provoke deep self-reflection of how one considers the lived experiences of others, how those differences impact others' well-being, and how one can contribute to tangible social change. I'm glad to welcome each and every one of you, including our students, alums, staff, faculty, campus leadership, along with our community partners, colleagues, and friends from here, near and far, to this virtual event. You had many other options to spend your time this evening, but you chose to be here with us, and for that, we thank you for your attendance and your support. At this time, I recognize the tribal communities of the Goshute, Diné Navajo, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples, their elders, both past and present, and their future generations. We acknowledge their stewardship of Utah's lands. I acknowledge our signature sponsor of Westminster's Diversity Lecture Series, the B.W. Bastian Foundation. The foundation supports local and national institutions that benefit, encourage, and preserve the rights of individuals, promote equality for the LGBTQ+ community, and support HIV/AIDS programs. On behalf of the college, I continue to be thankful for the B.W. Bastian Foundation for their longtime partnership with Westminster to make this diversity lecture series possible. Also, I extend gratitude to the following organizations for their partnering sponsorships of our diversity lecture series, along with the Bastian Foundation: Cigna, Zions Bank, and the Rocky Mountain Power Foundation. So before we begin the conversation, starting with the introduction of our speakers, a few housekeeping details. To ensure that the event goes smoothly, please mute your audio. The chat function will be used to message relevant information, and you can share your questions there. And this event is being recorded for archival purposes. Sign language interpretation is being provided by ASL Communication, and the closed captioning function should be available along with the option to use the live transcription on the bottom of the screen. And now to our introductions. A shining aspect of Westminster College is our commitment to a student-centered approach to teaching, learning, and the overall collegiate experience. One example of this is to incorporate the student presence and the student voice in our events and activities. I'm delighted to introduce the student who will introduce our keynote speaker, who I have known since she arrived to Westminster 3 years ago and is now a flourishing third-year student majoring in nursing. Please welcome Jade Escobar with a warm round of virtual applause.
Thank you. So I'm here to introduce Dr. Dian Squire. Dr. Dian Squire is an associate professor and associate dean for inclusive excellence at Loyola University, Chicago's Marcella Niehoff School of Nursing. He previously was an assistant professor of counseling student affairs at Northern Arizona University, a visiting assistant professor at Iowa State University, and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Denver. Dian's research focuses on issues of diversity, equity, and justice in higher education. He particularly focuses on understanding how racism shapes university organization, culture, and experience. He utilizes organizational perspectives to help explain individual behavior and experience in order to transform organizational structures to support equity and justice. Welcome, Dr. Squire.
Thank you very much. Let me just go ahead and pull up my presentation here. Great, so thank you very much for that introduction, Jade. My name is Dian Squire. I am, as presented, the Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence at the Marcella Niehoff School of Nursing, or as we like to call it, Loyola Nursing, here in Chicago. My talk tonight is called Settling on a Critical Race Consciousness, and I'll explain what that means as we kind of get moving through here. I also want to start with a land acknowledgement. And so at Loyola University of Chicago, our land acknowledgement reads, "The Loyola community occupies the ancestral homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires. This council was an alliance which formed based on the shared language, similar culture, and common historical background of its three historical members, the Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe nations." And just for those who maybe are not as familiar with land acknowledgement, a land acknowledgement is essentially a formal statement of recognition and respect for Indigenous peoples and the traditional stewards of the land. And they also recognize the relationship between our institutions and the Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. So it's a sign of respect and gratitude for those whose territory we reside on and learn on. I want to start with this quote that reads, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it has been faced. History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are history." The history of race and racism and other forms of racial discrimination leads back to the colonization of this land that we now call the United States of America. The forced genocide and eradication of Native communities, the stealing of their lifeways and knowledge systems, and the writing and breaking of government treaties is only part of the dark and disgusting quote unquote past that leads to the current treatment of Native American communities around sovereignty over their land and water, the concern of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the continued stealing of land, and the idea of terra nullius that renders Native Americans invisible in today's world. The plight of enslaved Black people stolen from homelands, put into chattel slavery, forced to endure not just hard labor, but also medical experimentation, separation, killings, trauma, and the stealing of knowledge systems lays the foundation for understanding the experiences of Black people today. Both of these experiences, broadly understood, lead to the racialization of other groups via the process of racial formations, which I'll talk about today. So our job is to paint a little more of that picture for you, so we can come to an understanding that the pressing issue of racism in our schools, cities, and broader society are not current calls for justice, but deeply embedded in injustices and violence accrued over the last 6 centuries. Some of you might be familiar with this diagram. It's the Iceberg Diagram, clearly by the picture. And the saying goes that it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? So we can see maybe 20% of the iceberg, but 80% of the iceberg is actually underneath the water. And so, this one actually has to do with health, where, the text on the slide, but I want to maybe apply it to a college context. So at the events level, it's what we can see in front of us, right? So it's what just happened. So we might say that students of color are burned out, they may be angry, and therefore we're seeing more attrition from this group. The layer below the water are these patterns, right? The trends that have been happening over time. So we might describe these in this scenario as high turnover in leadership, decreased engagement in programming and clubs and fraternity and sorority life, as well as increases in activism and student pushback to existing policy programs or procedures that make it difficult for student success. The next level underneath are the underlying structures, right? So what is influencing the patterns, and what are the relationships between all of these parts, the patterns and events? Well, we might say that the underlying structures are microaggressions, racism in the residence halls, in various campus spaces, in the curricula, and broadly in society. We might see exclusion, for instance, in the curricula, marginalization of Black voices in the classroom, space being taken up by white clubs and organizations and not allowed for Black and brown student organizations, cultural appropriation all around us, and we're coming on Halloween, so we'll see more of it, being ignored when making a complaint, or as exploitation when students of color are used as diversity pawns in our marketing and advertisement. But below that, we have our mental models, right? So this is what assumptions and beliefs and values do we hold about our system, and what beliefs keep the system in place. So in this scenario, racial stratification is correct and good because white people are dominant and deserving, right? These are some of the mental models that we might be carrying. White people are superior. Why can't all people of color be like Asians? If I can do it, they can do it too. I don't care about them. I'm worried about myself and my people. So I believe that first attending to history will allow us all the opportunity to open up our minds to new mental models that can provide space for justice. And I want to start with the idea of settler colonialism. So this is sort of taking a step back from even talking about racism and really looking at what sort of technologies of domination really inform how our society is structured today. So settler colonialism is considered to be a structure and a process. So it structures the way that our society functions, how it's organized, the way our government is, organized and situated. And it's also a process in that, going down to the second bullet, it's ever changing and ever present, right? So it's not a historical artifact. It's actually a current process that changes over time to the needs of the ruling class, right? So dominant white cis hetero maleness. One of the defining features of settler colonialism is that land and people are made into property. And we'll talk more about that as we move on. But essentially, it opens it up for people and property to be exploited and commodified. And so settler colonialism ultimately is the root of individualism, capitalism, exploitation, dehumanization, and racialized domination. So I'm going to break this down a little bit more for us. The three main technologies of settler colonialism are considered to be whiteness, indigenous erasure, and anti-Black racism. So whiteness is this socially constructed ideology that is dominant and says that white is right, essentially. So it creates and reproduces a set of normative beliefs and knowledges and ways of being that created lopsided power, privilege, and domination for those who invest in whiteness and for white people. So that kind of goes on to the second bullet point. It's not something that only white people hold. However, all white people engage in whiteness because they are socialized into it, and other communities can also consent to whiteness as well. So Cheryl Harris is a legal scholar who has written a lot about whiteness as property. And she noted that whiteness is, quote, the embodiment of white privilege, right? So these seemingly normal, neutral, and non-self-correcting ways of being and doing draw from white supremacist and settler colonial illogical beginnings. So in its more simple form, whiteness essentially presents itself through privileging individualism, self-reliance, competition, privatization, property rights, over-reliance on quantitative outcomes, power-neutral analyses, and the reproduction and dominance of these particular worldviews. When we go over to indigenous erasure, we have to note that indigenous people have existed on this land for thousands of years, and that they continue to exist on this land today. If you didn't know, there are over 570 federally and state recognized tribes here in the US, right? And they all have their own languages and traditions, practices, knowledge systems, medicinal practices, and land. A lot of our named sciences are actually a result of white people taking concepts from Native Americans and using them for themselves. So when we talk about biology and engineering and things like that, well, indigenous people actually had these processes many, many years ago, and white people kind of went into those areas and stole those concepts and renamed them. The ultimate goal for indigenous folks is sovereignty, right? So sovereignty is this idea that you have full control and decision-making power over your body, your land, your worldviews, your knowledge systems, right? And the idea of indigenous erasure is this idea that Native Americans needed to be cleared of their land so that colonizers could build new materials in the world, right? They could build their homes and cities, etc. So the best way to erase indigenous people was obviously to kill them, which is a physical and material erasure. And the other idea was to kill the ideas and knowledge of indigenous peoples. So we have these boarding schools, right, that removed cultural clothing, hair, language, and taught Christianity as an attempt to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man, right? There's also blood quantum issues that are controlled by the US government as another attempt to erase indigenous people, slashing of crops, forced killing of animals, restricted farming, all to have this idea that Native people do not exist. For anti-Black racism, it's this ideology that dehumanizes Black people and marginalizes them. It's a structure and system that predetermines Black people's place in society, and that's held up by a wide range of policy and programs and processes that have existed for hundreds of years, right? So that could be education policy, transportation policy, food deserts, etc. Really started in the 1600s, as I noted, with chattel slavery. It continues today in other forms of chattels, I would say exploitation, which I'll explain later, but also through the erasure of Black cultural artifacts, right? So we have had a lot of conversations, and there have even been some policies passed about hair, right? What types of styles of hair Black people can have in the workplace. There's also intergenerational trauma, and other forms of racism extend off of this. So I wanted to set this foundation for us to think about as we move through the rest of the presentation. So I want to introduce this idea of racial formation if you haven't heard of it, but racial formation is the socio-historical process by which racial categories and understandings of race are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. So the idea ultimately is that race is created and manipulated daily. Omi and Wenat, they write a lot about this, and they argue that racial formation is a process of historically situated projects. So we'll talk about racial formation projects in just a second, in which human bodies and social structures are represented and organized. It's linked to this idea of hegemony, right? So who gets to construct what is right within our society, what people should think and do, believe, have ethics around, right? So it's sort of this ruling, organized ideology. And it works on a social level to influence the way that we think about race and also how we organize human beings. So, you know, there are kind of widespread system level impacts of racial formation that we see every 10 years, for instance, right? So the census, and there's always these changing constructs of race and ethnicity that happened in the conversations about how we collect data, which ultimately then influences funding for local municipalities. And this is a racial formation project. The conversations that are being had help determine who gets seen and who doesn't get seen within the scope of the American public. There are also individual level impacts, such as when a person says to me or another person, "You don't look Asian," or "You don't look Black," because there are historical issues around colorism based in phenotype, and also physical attributes that are associated with histories of racism, particularly scientific racism and medical racism. Similar racial formation experiences can be seen in the rearticulation of immigrant to mean Mexican, and in the demonization of Native Americans, which I sort of just mentioned, right? Facilitated expansion and manifest destiny. So what is racism? Whiteness scholars define racism as an encompassing economic, political, social, and cultural structures, actions, and belief that systematize and perpetuate an unequal distribution of privileges, resources, and power between white people and people of color, right? We sort of want to move away from the idea of race because race doesn't actually provide us with a power analysis of what's happening in between groups of people or in our society, right? So we want to move the conversation towards racism, right, which is the system of oppression, right, that perpetuates an unequal distribution of resources, power, and privilege, right? So that's where we're moving forward to, and we want to make sure that when we talk about these issues from now on, that we're always talking about racism. So we can understand the organization of humans through the way resources and opportunities are distributed and available. And while race is an impermeable part of our decisions, we also have to understand that our statuses are related to these as well. And sometimes we can predict social behaviors and how people exist in the world by also taking that racism lens, that power lens. Omi and Winat say that the global project is to reshape relations between racial groups. So racial formation is something that we actually experience every day. And I want to go through a little activity with those who are in the room and who have a chat function available to them. So Omi and Winat write, one of the first things we notice about people when we meet them is their race. We utilize race to provide clues about who a person is. This fact is made painfully obvious when we encounter someone whom we cannot racially categorize, someone who is mixed or of an ethnic racial group we're not familiar with. Such an encounter becomes a source of discomfort and momentarily a crisis of racial meaning. And I want to talk about racial formation as an everyday experience because we've often heard this term color blindness. And we're moving to a new term called color evasiveness, which I'll explain in a minute. But when we say that we are post-racial, right, or quote unquote colorblind, then we're actually saying that we don't see race. But I think it's very true that when we walk around every day, race is one of the first things that we notice. And we ascribe certain experiences and identities and meaning to those people, right? So this is the idea of a crisis of racial meaning. When we can't categorize people based on how society has told us to see people, then we get in this moment of crisis where maybe we're confused or, and it basically says that we're not actually taking a really critical intersectional like power analysis about who people are and what they are and how they exist in the world. So I want to move to this picture because like I said, racial formation makes us question who people are in the world. And then we apply these predeterministic traits and values on them, which are often situated in historic and ongoing medical and scientific racism for media assumptions, stereotypes, and reinforced by our leaders. So in the chat, I just want you to, you don't have to do a lot, but I just want you to ask yourself, where is this person from? And what is their race? So I'll just give you like 30 seconds to type whatever you think. Okay, so Janice says this country, so the US, multiracial person. Bethany says no idea based on the photo. And Melanie says, you don't know, there are so many options, right? Yeah, so we're sort of sitting in this kind of like confused state for a second, because it doesn't kind of match our mental models. Okay, Megan says maybe they're from Central America. This person is actually Japanese and Eastern European. So they are biracial or bi-ethnic, and would probably identify as mixed race based on the National Geographic story that this picture came from. I'm going to show you another picture. So where do you think these girls are from? Okay, so Megan says Turkey, Jenny says Pakistan, Nepal. Not too far off, actually. So these are Iceland. So these are Mari girls. So it's an indigenous group in Russia, and most of them live in a region just north of Kazakhstan. When we look at what's happening in these cases, and what we see in the chat box are sort of racial formation projects playing out in our various contexts, right? So we bring our different experiences, backgrounds, travel experiences, education, etc. So our answers are going to vary slightly. Both of these groups of people are also from Kazakhstan, right? In addition to these three girls, right? So Kazakhstan actually represents over 130 different ethnicities and nationalities. And they were moved to Central Asia in the 1930s by the Soviet Union. And kind of going back to the initial introduction, these faces act as a counter story to what we believe to be race in the modern society. They tell a different tale of multiraciality, of indigeneity, of forced migration, multiculturalism, imperialism, racism, and dominance, right? So when we say that we can't see race, it's actually not true, right? We actually utilize all of our history, all of our mental models to make sense of who these people are, even though we might be incorrect at the end of the day. So that's why we want to move kind of away from race and think about racism and how it affects different groups. So I want to talk quickly about the evolution of modern racial awareness projects. So a racial project, as I sort of alluded to earlier, helps to explain how people of different races experience and interact with the world. There's all these distinct groups that go back throughout history, but it really wasn't until the Europeans traveled to the Americas that there was a modern conception of race, right? So this idea of a racial hierarchy then was formed, and it tried to essentially strictly categorize people in various groups, initially based on their skin color. As we see in the previous slide, it's very hard to do. So that's why we try to move away from it. So the Europeans' discovery of the new people raised questions as to which Native peoples could be exploited and enslaved. So I just have a couple examples here of how race has sort of changed across time. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, race was thought of as a biological concept, a matter of species. And this actually extended even closer to today as well. So this isn't necessarily just a historical matter. Voltaire wrote about Black people: if their understanding is not of a different nature from ours, it is at least greatly inferior. Jefferson wrote about Black people: I advance it, therefore, that the Blacks are inferior to the whites. And people today are still in search of a scientific definition of race. So we even had a New York Times columnist, and I believe it was in 2014, who tried to make a eugenics argument. And eugenics was a ideology utilized by the Nazis in World War II. So a racial project can be defined as racist if it creates and reproduces structures of domination based on essentialist categories of race. I want to make this a little more clear and not so heavy and theoretical by giving you a couple examples of how I see racial formation projects and racialization projects happening within university settings. So ultimately, I like to just say as a thesis, the university is a machine of the racial economy. And I'll talk about what that means. So I'm going to use MMM, or the MM myth, from now on, but this stands for the model minority myth. And our goal ultimately is to stop saying the model minority myth as to stop giving it power. So you might be familiar with the model minority myth from just general society, right? Which essentially says that like Asian people are incredibly smart and educated and wealthy, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a example of cultural racism and this idea of racial triangulation. So those are both of the racial formation projects that are happening that I'll explain in just a second. A little bit of the history behind why this stereotype began is because when Asian folks were allowed to come into the US after the Chinese Exclusion Act, they were actually recruited to come to the US. And the people that were recruited to come to the US tended to be East Asian people who were highly educated and somewhat wealthy already, right? So it was a kind of a confirmation bias when they started to utilize the term model minority myth, right? Because it was true. Most of the Asian people who lived in the US at that time were highly educated and were relatively wealthy. But we know that when we disaggregate data around Asian American groups and Pacific Islander groups, Native Hawaiian and indigenous groups, that there are many differences based on immigration status, social, economic status, and even geography, ethnicity, and nationality. So the model minority myth is what we call an example of a middleman minority notion. So it's a tool that exploits Asian Americans, placing them in a racial bind between whites and other people of color, and in this case, particularly Black people. So you can see in this photo, you see white people up top, Asian American folks in the middle, and Black people down below. So this racial arrangement essentially benefits the white elite in the US racial hierarchy, as demonstrated by the concepts of racial triangulation and cultural racism, which I'll explain in just a second. So essentially whites are pitted against Black people, utilizing Asian American people. And the narratives that we hear often are, why aren't you like Asian people? Why can't you be as successful as Asian people, right? So this term model minority myth was attributed to William Peterson in the 60s, and he presented the socioeconomic success among, like I said, a select segment of Asian Americans as the antithesis to Black people's claims to persistent racial oppression, particularly in the civil rights movement, right? So according to the theory, Asian Americans are simultaneously limited in their political and civic voice and presented as an example of success, despite being racially minoritized in order to preserve white supremacy. So essentially, this is at its core a really like patronizing practice that maintains white dominance by disregarding the lived experiences of one group in order to shame another group. Model minority myth is also an embodiment of a process of cultural racism, whereby Asian Americans, as the middleman minority, are used to discipline other minoritized groups to ultimately distract scrutiny away from systems of white dominance. Therefore, the model minority myth, through the process of racial triangulation, it bolsters cultural racism and color evasive racist ideology by discrediting one racially minoritized group's real struggles with racial barriers and discrimination through the valorization of oversimplified stereotypes of another minoritized group. So it's not simply enough. It's not simply so the model minority myth is not simply a stereotype, right, of the self-sufficient high academic minority achievement of Asian Americans. It's actually a much more insidious racial device that's used to uphold a global system of racial hierarchies and white supremacy. The next example I want to give you, I call Love My Naps But Stay Woke, the case against self-care. So in this article that a colleague of mine, Nicolazzo, let me take some water here, wrote, we essentially make the argument that self-care rhetoric is a form of oppression. So we need to first remember that settler colonialism is based on the ability to turn people into property and then to exploit those people, commodify them, punish them for non-compliance, and focus on an organization's capital gain over the human. So we quote here, self-care is often thought of as relaxation tactics one must complete in light of the ongoing stressors, anxieties, and duress of increased work demands, particularly in the do more with less culture often found in universities today. These tactics are often additional tasks one must take on as they are not incorporated into daily life. Self-care rhetoric also prompted us to continue to analyze the ways that capitalistic principles have harnessed the power within our society and in higher education that treats people, particularly those who hold marginalized identities, as a means of production at the neglect of their mental health. So our thesis for the paper, I'll read it here for you, says that self-care rhetoric attempts to soften the harsh realities of capitalism that works to turn people's livelihoods, mental health, and social well-being into quantifiable output. It turns people into property to be used for institutional profit. It maximizes the amount of labor that a graduate student, so that was the group we were studying, puts out while minimizing the need to authentically care about the humanness of a person. To be clear, we are not arguing that self-care is bad. We all want a massage, a soy candle, and a hot bath. We are arguing that self-care rhetoric, devoid of fundamental shifts in how the field structures the work of graduate students, is toxic and detrimental to the mental health of our students and the sustainability of the field. Right, so the paper, as I mentioned, we were looking at graduate students, particularly those who had marginalized identities, and we were doing it in higher education. So my previous life as a faculty member was in the field of education. So we ultimately asked the questions of how do we see exploitation, competition, individualism, fear, retribution, consumption, and profit play out. And I want to ask you the same questions if you want to just put it in the chat while I'm talking, right? How do you see in higher education, in the university setting, that there is exploitation, competition, individualism, fear, retribution, and profit playing out? You can just put it in the chat and then we can have people take a look at that. So ultimately what we argued is that there is this sort of idea of common sense exploitation. So Antonio Gramsci contributed the idea of hegemony, which helps us to understand the relationship between ruling powers and the working class. So through coercion, economic, physical, legal, and cultural violence, the ruling class can ensure people's alignment with this hegemonic state. It's ultimately an ideological domination that has material outcomes that affect such domains as morality, politics, culture, and ethics. So some of the things that we found around consent and coercion, right, is that those with power often ally with others who have power in order to maintain that power. And we can see a lot of that happening today with all these huge bills that are being tried to pass in the Senate, right? And we see these large corporations allying together to actually strip away some of these priorities that were originally put into the bill. Power in our society is maintained through consent and coercion. So coercion, right? It might not be something that you always realize is happening, but you can coerce people with lesser power into working by, once again, threatening their economic, physical, legal realities, right? So you can say, well, you signed this contract, I'm going to sue you if you don't do this work. If you don't work and do, work the extra hours, you will be fired. If you don't come in on the weekend and I'm not paying you, overpay, you will be fired. We see this happening all the time, actually. This is not very rare. So ultimately, those with lesser power are coerced into working, or they actively consent to the ruling class in order to stay safe from retribution. So before even any of that coercion takes place, they might just suck it up and deal with it, right? So this consent and coercion really works in concert to control the masses through maintaining this order and this domination. And for our graduate students, we saw this happening quite a bit in sort of exploitation of their labor, making them do the work of faculty members or the work of full-time professionals on our campuses without actually getting paid anymore, while also doing a full course load. And for the students in my program, they're also doing 20-hour assistantships. So they'd ultimately be working 40, 50, 60 hours a week and getting paid maybe $14,000 a year. But there's coercion there because if they, in my field, student affairs, if they didn't have those assistantships, then they couldn't get jobs, because employers also upheld this power structure by requiring all students or all employees to have graduate assistantship, internship experiences. Yes, Bethany has a good example in the chat. Thank you. So we want to obviously return to people, not property, right? So this idea of the 40-hour work week was created by GM alongside with the United Auto Workers Union, and it was codified in 1938. This was actually widely opposed by corporations, right? They actually wanted you to work more into the 45, 50-hour work week type of day, kind of standard. But ultimately they got it down to, the 8 hours a day. But the average person today actually works at least 8.8 hours a day. But we sort of asked the question, like, did it always have to be this way? Does it have to be this way now, right? So we want to kind of move to this idea of decolonization. So thinking contrary to these settler, colonial, and whiteness notions, right, of exploitation, commodification. So ultimately, decolonizing work means that we divest in these methods of extraction, so the extraction of labor, for the purpose of transformation into property and the use of the benefit of capitalistic endeavors, right? So we want to move away from extraction of people's labor for corporate profit. So what does this mean besides ending capitalism? Well, we could reduce the 40-hour work week, right? Which we're finding for 9-to-5 laborers is actually more than enough to get things done. And obviously we need to pay hourly wage earners a living wage plus benefits, if not even a little bit more. And we could also increase leisure time, right? And leisure time has not been shown to impact any sort of productivity, which is why a lot of organizations are moving to the 4-day work week. And we see a lot of flexibility in the hybrid learning practices that we have, right? However, what's holding us back a little bit are these mental models, right? This idea that working is an American value, that you have to work to be seen as good and contributing to society, and working at a certain level that is incredibly dehumanizing, right? And I like to say American value is also a value of whiteness because of where it comes from. So the value of hard work permeates throughout society, as does the contradictory value of self-care or leisure, but never will the two actually balance out in meaningful ways until we actually fundamentally shift our mental models and our structures around work, right? There will always be fear of getting in trouble, losing wages, or losing one's job. And these threats are real, and they're made against my students. I've seen them being made against, and I've seen them be made against my friends and colleagues too, right? In both explicit and implicit ways. One way we might be think about changing some of this is to look toward Indigenous people's lifeways for some guidance, right? So in instead of a culture of rugged individualism and scarcity, Indigenous societies worked in ways that developed skill sets for progressive communal work. So instead of individualism, we're looking at communal work, right? So that means that instead of individual members of society being able to only engage in one task, tasks were taught to everybody, all neophytes, right? Like, so all young people within the society, and fostered through processes which today we might call professional development and community-based development. So as a result of everybody working communally, there was mass productivity, there was engaged problem solving, there's an understanding of multiple systems without a singular great man, quote unquote, leader, right? So ultimately, how much work one person did was not relevant or not as relevant as community building and valued success, right? So humanhood wasn't linked to one's ability to be productive, but rather a group's final articulation of prosperity. So ultimately, productivity, consumption, and profit are all settler colonial concepts that have been reinforced by an ever-evolving capitalistic system, of which our universities are a reproducing component. I want to return to the iceberg to bring us around to understanding what are the mental models and underlying structures guiding our work. We see how a racialization project called racial triangulation utilizes incorrect cultural assumptions embedded in cultural racism against Asians to reinforce a racial hierarchy that places whites at the top, Asian people somewhere in the middle, and Black people at the bottom, which then reinforces cultural stereotypes about Black people. In the self-care exhibit, we see that settler colonialism, upheld by whiteness's belief in individualism and competition, creates a system where people who are marginalized face coercive tactics that dehumanize them by holding to their feet to the fire of capitalism at the fear of losing their financial livelihoods. And I'm sure you can think of many more examples, and feel free to put them in the chat. And I see Carolyn and some other folks are doing that, so thank you for engaging in that way. So once again, we want to move away from race and talk more about racism, right? Because the magic of white supremacy is that its presence is obscured by the focus on race or color-evasive post-racial views of diversity. We also need to kind of move beyond this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and really be thinking about anti-racism and decolonization. So another example, when a Black teenager is unfairly profiled by police, we say it's because it's the color of his skin, which as a construction avoids the racism at play, right? From the segregated neighborhood, the officer patrols the neighborhood with a belief in Black criminality, and that ultimately shapes the approach to crime. And it also obscures the extent to which this isn't just different treatment, but it's unequal treatment rooted in unequal conditions. So CRT ultimately provides us a lens through which we can examine factors contributing to racialized experiences. It really strives to end racial oppression as a part of a broader goal to end all oppression. Racism is about power. It's not about inclusion, opportunity, prejudice, or discrimination alone, right? It's a theoretical tool that allows us to expose structural and ingrained social features of racism. Race is socially constructed, racism is purposeful, it's everywhere, and it's contributed to the manifestations of group advantage and disadvantage. The tenets of CRT, critical race theory, are that racism is endemic to American life, right? So it's a defining characteristic of American society, starting at the very beginning, right? As I mentioned, settler colonialism to today. CRT helps us to challenge the dominant ideology of race neutrality, objectivity, color evasiveness, and meritocracy, right? So this idea that we don't see race, it doesn't matter, that we are in a post-racial society, that everybody can succeed if they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. With the power analysis of racism, we see that that's not true. It requires the recognition of experiential knowledge of people of color. It's interdisciplinary and intersectional. So we need to be pulling from all kind of areas of knowledge and fields of study to understand racism. And at the end of the day, it's committed to social justice. So we really use CRT to meet the goals of racial justice and decolonization. So a couple more examples of racism in campus life. So obviously we have color evasiveness, and let me finally explain what this means, right? So we used to use color blindness, but it sort of gave too much leeway, if you will, to the person who argues that they are colorblind. We want to actually recognize and say that ignoring race is a deliberate and not a passive act, right? So you're actually evading it. We also want to recognize and dismantle the inherent ableism in equating the word blind with ignorance or deficiency. We also want to recognize that racism is multimodal and not only seen. And we also want to recognize disability and ableism as social constructs that are created similar to race and racism. So there are 4 types of color evasiveness. One is abstract liberalism. So this idea of individualism that we talked about, the bootstraps mentality. Naturalization, so that racism is natural, unavoidable, and it's just the way it is. Cultural racism, which I talked about earlier. So cultural differences legitimize exclusion and discrimination based on racialized notions and ranking of culture. And minimization of racism, right? Saying racism doesn't exist, it's not a problem anymore. And there are many ways that we can see this playing out in higher education, such as anti-affirmative action arguments that are happening right now, over-incarceration of Black people, segregated schools, saying that Black people are lazy, they want to take it easy, etc. So you can do some more research on what that looks like as well. We also see it in this idea of assimilation, right? So we want students to assimilate to a dominant campus culture, rather than recognizing that all of our students come from individual cultural backgrounds and experiences in the world that are unique and valuable and important to our campus life. When we say things like, one Loyola, or everybody's a Rambler, right? We're actually asking students, faculty, staff, and alum to assimilate into a particular ideology that is embedded in white supremacy. Everything that we have in this society is embedded in white supremacy, leading back to settler colonialism, right? Unless they actively work against it. They're actively anti-racist, right? So we're actually asking our students of color, our queer students, our indigenous students, our international students, et cetera, to assimilate into a dominant campus culture and actually erase their identities, right? So we're actually minimizing racism. We're actually ignoring cultural racism, right? And we're saying that anybody here at this university can make it if they just try hard enough, if they just become a Rambler, or whatever your mascot is. Obviously, we see it in privilege, right? So privileged ways of knowing and doing of white people and white faculty. It removes these considerations of cultural difference. It gives benefits of the doubt to some groups over other groups, et cetera. There's also a lot of internal bias that can lead to privileges for certain groups. We also see avoidance playing out, right? So we avoid history. And so it's really important for us to think about, and a lot of universities are doing this, what your relationship is to native lands and enslaved Black people, right? Some of our most quote unquote elite universities within this country were actually built on the backs of native people and enslaved Black people. literally lifting the blocks, putting them down, and sometimes having to even take care of white male students, right? So we want to actually explore these relationships. And Harvard has a great report that they put out, and some other universities do too as well. So maybe you have one that you have at your institution, but if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it for sure. Obviously, we talked about this idea of individualism already. I won't cover it. And then domination, right? So this domination of one worldview. So we want to move away from awareness. So we're starting to raise awareness here and move toward this idea of a critical race consciousness, right? So finally getting back to our title slide. But critical race consciousness is this ability to perceive oppression within social, political, and economic realms, and to encourage others to act against oppressive systems and think more critically. We ultimately want to develop a capacity to assess critically the university environment and build defenses against messages and practices that imply that the lived experiences of some minoritized individuals is of lesser value than others. And we want to enhance the capacity to affect significant positive change to improve conditions in our education for minoritized populations. And what I really like to highlight in these sections is this idea of developing capacity, right? So leadership capacity, the idea that engaging in this critical thought and praxis, right? This reflective engagement doesn't only happen through one person or a small group of people or a president or a provost or a dean. We all have to develop our own leadership capacity to engage in this critical race work, to build our critical race consciousness. For a lot of people, that means that when they're in a meeting, sometimes they feel stuck when something happens. You know that something felt wrong. You know that something was said that irked you, but you don't know what to say. You don't know how to respond. So building capacity allows us to quickly assess what just happened in that situation and then address it in the moment or shortly after. So we have to continue to build those skills in order to successfully sort of start to change the culture within our universities and the mental models that we work from as well, right? So that could come down to even a simple word, right? I'll give an example. In a past faculty meeting or a meeting of our strategic planning committee, so I was in a full faculty meeting, one of the faculty members said to another person, basically, you cannot be the co-chair of this committee because you are not a trusted commodity. And in that moment, nobody really said anything, but for me, I heard the word commodity, right? So it's this really dehumanizing term that essentially equates this person with a product that is to be used for some purpose. And in this case, they are not trusted to engage in this process as the chair of this committee, okay? So when we use words like commodity and in relation to naming somebody or referring to somebody, we really are engaging in this idea of settler colonialism and whiteness and productivity, right? So I just want to give that short example there. Ultimately, what it means is that if we have these flawed conceptualizations of race, right? So we're not having these really critical consciousness. If we're not having a critical consciousness, then it really undermines our efforts to create these inclusive and equitable learning environments and can ultimately exacerbate inequalities, right? Which do correspond heavily to race. Color evasiveness as well limits our ability to draw strength from our diverse experiences and perspectives by suggesting that differences do not exist or are too controversial to acknowledge and thus better to be left ignored. And this one is one that really irks me too, right? This idea that you don't want to have skin in the game because you might face retribution of some sort. You might irk a friend or a colleague, right? But we really do all, once again, need to develop this capacity to have these conversations. The conversations don't always have to be, and probably shouldn't be, yelling matches, but they do need to be happening, right? They need to be, attention needs to be drawn to them, and people do need to be corrected, right? Because we're trying to address these mental models. We can't just address the action that's happened. We need to go deep into engaging, why did that person actually say that thing? What were those stereotypes that they were raised on or are being fed by media and society, right? How were they raised? What do they know or not know about the history of this group and how racism has shaped the way that they are now being perceived in this context? So for me, it always goes back to history too. History is one of the first things that I start with in most of my presentations and course discussions, and I think is a great way to jump off into additional conversations around racism. Without a critical race consciousness, leaders are also limited in their ability to effectively lead in diverse social contexts, and those who lack opportunities to talk constructively about complex racial issues are more likely to revert to deficit thinking, right? So this automatic idea that it is always the person of color's fault, that they are not successful in the classroom or in the university, that their retention relies on them only and not actually thinking about what's happening in the classroom or among their relationship with their academic advisor and themselves, or in their residence hall room with their roommate or their RA, right? These are actually retention tools, but they are not applied equitably across all racial groups, right? And that goes back to the mental models of these individual people who are hired to implement these roles on campus. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I want to thank you for your time, and we have a little bit of time to engage in discussion. If we want to ask questions, so I will just go ahead and stop talking.
Dr. Dian, thank you for your lecture, and as much as I'm familiar with this content, it's always something new to learn, and it's always new angles to consider this context, and as it's consider this subject matter. And as you focused on kind of the university is your kind of this snapshot, this unit of analysis, it certainly allowed me to consider that there's applicability across several social institutions that exist in our country. I often say that colleges and universities are microcosms of the general society. So those same patterns that you mentioned exist in our K-12 school systems, our religious institutions, as well as our corporate institutions as well. So I'm really curious as to if you have a brief moment to maybe think about how we can think about how those patterns exist in those other spaces that we all inhabit, that has influenced our socialization too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. So, that's why I define CRT, which it is, as both a theoretical tool, but also a form of practice. And so we have those 5 tenets that I listed, and they are relatively broad in general in the sense that they can be applied to any context that we live in, right? And that's why I start with the settler colonialism aspect of it too, right? This is the formation of our society. Everything is built on top of that, right? So those systems of anti-Blackness and whiteness and indigenous erasure, they continue today. As I mentioned in the first slides about an hour ago, right? They are always changing and always present. So we don't necessarily always see chattel slavery in the same way that we might have it in our imaginary, right? As we might see in a movie or read or anything like that. But there are different forms of slavery that are happening around the world that some look very similar and some don't as well, right? The carceral state is kind of a good example of that, right? Like probably the most clear example of that in the US. So, you know, I think anybody can sort of say, okay, I belong to, or I work also in this organization over here. Like if you're, you know, a community member or even if you're a student, you know, working part-time, and ask yourself questions of, you know, how is racism playing out in here, right? So how is power playing out in this space, right? Does one person sit at the top of the organization and hand down edicts and you must do them or you will be fired? Is there a more collaborative approach, right? Where that is actually more maybe what we would call in like modern org theory, just like a feminist approach, right? And then you can start then maybe doing a little bit of your own research and, you know, saying like, oh, what are the sorry, it's like 9 o'clock here. What are the components of a feminist organization, right? Like, what does that mean? Well, usually means there's a flat structure, there's shared decision making, et cetera. And you can say, okay, but these are also questions you can ask if you are applying for jobs, right? So, you know, Jade will be going off soon to become a nurse. And these are important questions to ask, right? What is your organization's philosophy around anti-racism? What do you do in your organization to address anti-racism? How is collaborative decision-making a role? Like, how does collaborative decision-making take place when making major decisions in this health system? We can ask all of these questions based on sort of the broad concepts that I offered in this presentation today. And like I said, you know, the love my naps but stay woke. We were looking specifically at graduate students, but I'm pretty sure almost everybody in this room, if not everybody in this room, has felt those pressures before at some point in their career and can apply it, that idea of exploitation and property and consumption and commodification to themselves if they really take a critical examination of what's happening, right? And universities are really, really great at doing this. And they do it under this idea of one rambler, right? This idea that, oh, we all work together towards this broader mission or goal. And if you don't, you're being a bad colleague, right? And if you're a bad colleague, there is a chance that you will not exist in your position very long. So what do? You have to change yourself. You have to mold into, you have to assimilate, as I mentioned, into this organization. Sometimes you're lucky enough to be in maybe a sub-organization where you have leadership that's really strong and can kind of buffer you from that piece, which is amazing. But I still also don't believe that people will last very long in those offices either, right? So there has to be a larger community conversation about what's going on in that space. And sometimes these issues are broader than just a campus, right? They're kind of they're field specific or field driven even. And so that's a bigger mission to go on, and one that you have to decide if you want to do it or not. But ultimately, some of our suggestions at the end of the piece were that we have to move towards more communal ways of engaging and supporting each other, right? So one example, and we were talking about graduate students, there is this idea of individualism, right? That I have to be successful on my own, and I don't want to work with anybody. I don't actually want to do group work. Somebody else is going to let me down, right? They're not going to do as good of a job as I could do on my own. And I'm not going to share my notes with anybody because then that person's going to get a good test score. And I don't know, I don't think I'm going to, right? And I need to make sure they at least do worse than I am, or, whatever the case might be. Well, I mean, I actually told my students that you're actually stronger and smarter if you work together. And you also you actually end up doing maybe a little bit less work at the end, but getting kind of maximum benefits, right? And you also support each other when one person is having a bad week, whether it's a bad mental health week, a bad family issue, you're just tired, whatever the case might be, right? You have a new project that's been put on your plate. Why not engage in some form of note sharing where you have a rotation or 2 people create notes a week and then other folks can look in on them? It has to be an agreed upon relationship. Obviously, you have to trust that your colleagues are going to do that work and you have to hold each other accountable. But why not share those notes so that one, you're learning from somebody else who's sharing in those notes that may have caught something different. And also that you're not leaving your classmate hanging. If you've gone into a classroom and you didn't do the reading for the week, it's almost like, why are you even there? You're bored, you're on your phone, you're not learning anything. But if you had the opportunity to say, oh, I read the shared notes, thank you so much, I can at least like participate a little bit in the class and at least understand what's going on, then everybody gets to learn in that space. And everybody gets to grow in that space together. That is a much more compassionate and communal and caring way and humanizing way to work in the world, right? So, and we can do that in other venues too, right? This is a classroom setting, but we can engage communally in many different ways. So, that's just sort of what I think about. So yeah, I see Anthony's question here, and I'll go ahead and just read it. It says, I'm challenged with getting colleagues to acknowledge that this is indeed real, and many default to the bootstraps ideology. Do you have any suggestions to get peers to sit in on this uncomfortable truth? That is a great question. That is an enduring question. And I don't have the number one answer. I do think it is context specific. And I do think that it begins with, if they're not able to even get to that point, relationship building. So, I'm pretty new in my role here as the Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence. And so one of my number one goals right now is to build relationships with everybody in the school, right? Because once they know who I am personally, and once I know a little bit about who they are personally, then we actually don't come at each other in any sort of way that's combative, right? Because nobody wants to have a meeting with the associate dean to talk about racism, but they will have a conversation with an associate dean to just say, hey, and learn a little bit more about you, and your philosophies and things like that. So that's one way that I usually start it. A lot of times I think we go into organizations and we label people based on their titles, right? So, and that some of those titles carry histories that have nothing to do with the person who's currently in the role. That is a really detrimental way to think about getting work done within an organization. And so there has to be a little bit of a leap of faith, a benefit of the doubt, and a commitment to engaging in building that relationship back in a different way. Sometimes those histories they're real, right? There's material realities to them, but you also have to say like, this is a new person or this is a different type of person, right? So that's how I would start it. And then I would also perhaps do things like invite those folks to attend something with you, right? Or go out to lunch and have a conversation, just sort of bring up a topic that you are interested in discussing, right? That also requires you to be really comfortable and efficacious in having some of these conversations as well. So part of getting other people to change their minds is also to make sure that your mind is right and your heart is right and that when they have questions, you feel comfortable enough to maybe not always answer all of them. We don't all know everything about everything, but to be able to drive a conversation towards a better outcome or a different outcome than maybe it has happened in the past.
Dr. Squire, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, I see one here with Bethany.
Yes.
I think, yeah, hold on one second. So it says, sometimes I worry that in a system that favors individual merit and accountability, when we move to communal work, the recognition that emerges, reifies existing hierarchies and benefits those with ascribed privilege. So I assume that you're saying that people with dominant identities or positional powers often gain the benefits of communal work at the expense of those who maybe actually did the work. Yeah, I mean, that, okay, pretty much, thanks. So yeah, so I think that is an enduring issue for sure. I think it is, once again, campus specific. Everything is specific, right? So we always want to use that lens before we sort of dive into answers. I think part of engaging in communal work is backing each other up and being able to stand up for each other and voice discontent together. One of the things that I do or one of my philosophies of working in DEI work is to make sure that everybody that I work with has a shared language around what we call inclusive excellence. It's building that leadership capacity that I mentioned before, right? So how do we build the capacity for every person in my office or on this team to be able to answer questions to leadership, to be able to use a language of whatever your campus uses. We use inclusive excellence in our school and anti-racism, and to make very clear about who's doing work and what types of work that they're doing, so that when these sort of situations come up, that you can stand together and say, you know, actually, that's not true. And by standing together, I don't mean that you're all in a staff meeting, you know, standing up and raising your fists and yelling at the leader on the stage who stole your idea. But it could be that each one of you individually is going back to your departments or your programs or to your colleagues in lunch meetings and saying, actually, that wasn't what happened, right? This is actually what happened. We were all there, and this is how we interpreted it. And those communal voices, right? Multiple voices are stronger than one is very true. Those sort of shared moments, I think, are really important. So that's sort of how I see my job and how I work, how I'm trying to work and spread, you know, the gospel of inclusive excellence, or whatever you want to call it, right? We need to build leadership capacity. We need to have a shared language, and we need to train people on how to help self-efficacy to do this work. So that's what I guess I'll say shortly, because I know we got to wrap up here.
Dr. Squire, there is a compelling question from Megan, and it's real time, right? Because in Utah, at least a couple of school districts, Davis School District was mentioned in the question, dealing with some very tangible, real time issues around racially hostile, racist learning environments in these K-12 districts. And the question is, how do we prime others to face, speak to, acknowledge the problem right in front of them?
So is it like parents who are being hostile in that space, or
Teachers,
everybody?
Everybody.
Oh, teachers. Okay, everybody is. Yeah, I mean, that's hard, right? Like, I mean, my job is to take 250 people and make them believe in inclusive excellence and anti-racism, right? Not an easy task. It's going to be slow. However, if you and a group of dedicated others can be engaged in this work really actively in your communities, maybe not even in the schools, but in your communities, then you raise a different type of awareness that I think is really important, right? You also don't have to call, as you typed in there, you don't have to call it CRT, right? They are not using CRT correctly in their arguments. It's not even CRT. Nobody teaches CRT in K-12. It's just not a thing, right? We barely teach it in higher ed.
Yes.
So it's a red herring, right? So I think the idea is you don't have to say CRT, right? You can sort of start easier by just talking about stereotypes or discrimination, right? Watch a YouTube video together with your closest friends, right? And have a conversation over a glass of wine. You know, that is the type of small community work that gets upscaled, right? Because ultimately the goal, this is leadership capacity building. Ultimately, the goal is that the 5 girlfriends that you invited over who all drank that glass of red wine will then go talk to 2, 3, 4 other people, right? Who could be parents in that area, who could be influencers in some way, who could be leaders, right? That is how the knowledge spreads. We have to just talk about it, right? We have to have the conversations. That's the whole idea behind color evasiveness. We don't talk about it. We ignore it. We purposely do that. But we have to say, no, we need to actually talk about this. And sometimes the school board meeting isn't the way to go, right? That's just a hostile environment, period. Not even talking about CRT, you know? So like, do what you can in the purview you have, and then sort of push out a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a long road for sure. I mean, there's other ways to think about like, how do you build your influence with those legislators, right? Maybe it's running for a local office, maybe it's you running for school board, you being on a PTA, like it, you know, it doesn't, I don't think we always have to think of doing this anti-racism work as I need to have a top positional leadership role, right? We all can do work in our individual spaces, and we might not see the benefits now, but we're hoping that we will see them in the long run, right? A colleague of mine, Native Hawaiian student affairs professional, once said to me, doing social justice work is like building a bridge across an ocean. It's going to take a long time to build that bridge, but what we're going to be doing is placing one plank at a time so that the people behind us can take one step closer to social justice, right? So you might not see, even in your lifetime, the significant change that you want to see, but you doing that work is laying that plank for the people behind you to be just a little bit closer to reaching that goal. I guess that's probably a good place to stop.
Dr. Dean, thank you so much for your time and your expertise, and really giving us a comprehensive overview with planks, if you will, to
That's
build,
right.
to build the conversation to have from the very foundational aspects of settler colonialism. And that's why I think I appreciated the title, right? Settler colonialism is one thing, but what we all need to settle on is a critical race consciousness, and that will guide our behavior and you know, individually and collectively going forward. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. Thank you to all the attendees who stayed with us throughout our time together. The recording of this lecture will be posted to the Westminster College YouTube channel for later viewing. For those of you that registered, and I think everyone did, to be here with us, you will get a brief survey at the end of this event or shortly thereafter to just inquire about your experience. And we appreciate that feedback in order to plan future diversity lectures and events. Our next event is an in-person event Monday, November 8th, our very special Veterans Day commemoration lecture. And I just put the link to the Eventbrite registration in the chat. So with that said, those are our closing remarks. Want to thank again all of you for being with us this evening, and be well. We'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everybody.